My woman got tired of the bullshit heartaches, tired of the greed.
All right, welcome to Movie and a Beer, everybody. This is Dan bringing us in, and we have a couple of awesome friends with us to discuss a very long and challenging film. If you aren't a big Elvis fan, but if you are a big Elvis fan, this movie is for you.
Then it's a long, challenging love fist. I am Aaron. I'm your peanut butter sandwich and peanut butter and banana sandwich expert.
And I'm Brian, your Baz Luhrmann expert.
Here it is, Elvis. 2 hours and like 40 minutes of lots of exponential visual success.
A lot of style, not a lot of story.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say that this film wasn't bad. The visuals were interesting. Mm-hmm. There was just about 20 minutes worth of story told in 2.5 hours.
It was 20 minutes of story crammed into 2 hours and 45 minutes.
How much can you stretch it?
It was a lot of music video and a lot of voiceover and not a lot of plot.
Reviews have been really mixed online. And so in knowing that we were going to watch this film ahead of time, Dan said, hey, let's go out to John's Marketplace in Southwest in Multnomah Village and see what we can find. Because I know that, and what little research I did ahead of time, I know that Elvis didn't drink beer. He did not like alcohol in general, but he never drank beer, or rarely did if he did at all.
And his mother was an alcoholic, so
Correct.
he was anti.
And you know, as I had heard, I don't know if it's true or not, he might have some Native American roots, and he would know that like drinking alcohol is not a good thing because
They've got a predisposition to alcoholism.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was a little challenging. I do know that Elvis, in my exposure to Voodoo Donuts here in Portland, they make an Elvis Memphis Mafia fritter that has banana, peanut butter, chocolate, and then something drizzled on it. I think, I can't remember what.
Stardust.
Honey or something.
Glitter dust.
But it's a big old fritter, apple fritter, or banana fritter, banana fritter that's all these extra things on it, like peanut butter and chocolate and stuff. Because he used to eat peanut butter banana sandwiches. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's a Mississippi thing because he's from Tupelo, Mississippi. And the film does kind of cover a little bit of his backstory. I was like, I need to find something that has a banana flavor.
Right.
That's not going to be challenging, and maybe something that's got peanut butter in it. There was a challenge because this is the fall, but there wasn't a lot of peanut butter oriented beers out there that I could find easily. So I did find one that was like a peanut butter and jelly or peanut butter and jammy kind of sour beer, and then a banana bread beer. And we're going to talk about those later on in the podcast. But the first thing we want to do is kind of break down this story. The story is fairly simplistic. I mean, it's just kind of an offshoot, a fictionalized account of Elvis's experience.
It's kind of a visual Wikipedia entry of Elvis's life.
Who was Elvis?
Biopic of Elvis with a Baz Luhrmann zhuzh onto it.
And it was told through Colonel Tom Parker's point of view because it was like, okay, this is, as I mentioned to the guys, I was like, it's going to be like his life flashing before his eyes as he dies. That's how it was set up from the very beginning.
And Colonel Tom Parker was the manager for Elvis, and some people believe that he was a shyster, and that's the way he's portrayed in this film.
Yes.
And he was a manager that took a lot from Elvis, and this film hypothesizes that he's the one that pushed Elvis to a point of exhaustion and abusing drugs and to death.
So I'm maybe going to give away my age now because I was born after Elvis had passed away, but I wonder, like, you know, how much of this is kind of how much was real and how much was revisionist history? Because I don't actually know. Like, I'm aware of Elvis and I'm aware of his cultural impact. I'm aware of his music. I think I saw maybe one of his movies. It didn't stick with me. But I think there's a certain strata of celebrity like Mariah Carey or Britney Spears where it comes to light after the fact how that like family or other close relationships get sort of poisoned by monetization and the finances and like pursuing fame. And I kind of wonder like if that's part of what happened with Elvis, but maybe he just did it bigger and earlier.
I think fame has a lot to do with it. I think that was a focal point. I just have concerns about how much is fictionalized versus reality. I mean, I'm sure that there are books that are out there about his life, and there's probably other films that
Several books,
probably
several
done a
films.
better job at telling the story. But again, the whole point of this is just to bring attention back to Elvis.
Spectacle.
From some of the stuff I read, this was pitched back in 2014. I mean, this has been a long time in the making.
So Elvis in his day was a huge superstar.
Yes.
And as a young editor, I edited a biography on the Presley family. His mom, his dad, Elvis,
Brian, you've done everything.
Priscilla,
You know everything.
Lisa Marie, her marriage to Michael Jackson. So I actually know remember some of the history of this. It wasn't fictionalized a whole lot. Okay. I mean, the Baz Luhrmann musical montages wasn't way off base. His interpretation of reality of history,
There's truth to it.
is fairly truthful, fairly accurate.
Through the lens of a Brady Bunch TV show introduction, because that sitcom introduction with you got the blacks, you got the squares.
Yeah, he used a lot of boxes on the screen.
70s era. I was like, wow, okay, well, he was his biggest fame was, I think, in the 60s, right? The 50s and 60s is when Elvis was.
Yeah, the early 50s. He is the father of rock and roll. He brought blues and
R&B music.
R&B music into acceptable white culture rock and roll. He is the father of rock and roll.
I was going to say, can you talk about Elvis without talking about race? And could you have made this movie 20 years ago? How much of the world has changed, and how much more okay is it to acknowledge? I'm familiar with B.B. King, Count Basie, some of the old blues, some of the old jazz.
At the time of Elvis in the early 50s, this was music that was not accessible to a white audience.
It was still segregated.
It was still a segregated music. He was the first one who sang, Big Mama Thornton's Hound Dog, so in a way that a white audience could hear it.
And so he had crossover.
And That's All Right Mama was written by a black artist, but white people never heard it until he cut that first disc for Sun Records.
Yeah. And he made it okay. He made it socially acceptable.
And the nice thing is that they focused on that somewhat in his younger life. They really said, he grew up, and there's some, I guess you would say it starts with him, Colonel Parker meeting him, and then it does all these flashbacks to his past of how he grew up, the environment he was in, what caused that to happen, and how much that influenced him as a young child.
I remember, I think I read something about Johnny Cash having kind of a similar sort of disadvantaged childhood and exposure to some of the same influences. And I don't know enough to know, was Johnny Cash really a champion for, race relations or equitability or, civil rights? But this film seemed to stress that Elvis was in some ways he had something to say about the MLK assassination. As a person who was born after Elvis died, I never connected the two intellectually. I don't know what Elvis said about MLK or JFK or other civil rights.
Honestly, I don't know either. I don't think he came out publicly and connected his influences in the way that this movie clearly does. This movie, it's important to this film to show that yes, Elvis got his influences from R&B music in the early 50s.
I mean,
and 40s.
he even says it. I mean, he himself, the actor. I mean, one of the lines is that yes, it's about that. Colonel Parker is trying to just get him to ignore it and just keep doing his normal thing, and you should just continue doing what you're doing because you're making money doing that, and instead of acknowledging it. And they showed, that was the whole, it was 20 minutes of the film was the Christmas special.
Oh yeah.
We're not going to really spoil a whole lot here because it's a biopic. So
I was going to say spoiler, people probably know what happened to Elvis.
Yeah. So he, instead of doing what was agreed with the sponsors, he went out in a leather jacket and pants. And then
kind of
the next day,
reclaimed his roots.
He reclaimed his roots and did that. And it was a recorded thing. It wasn't a live thing. So it was probably edited. And who knows how much was edited out. But then the next day, he he came up that night with his own song that was a protest song. And who knows? I mean, all of us here, we know about Elvis.
On the
but we
eve
have no idea.
of Bobby Kennedy's assassination.
Yeah.
Which I don't know how accurate. I'm sure it is. But it implies that while he was taping the Christmas special in 1968 was when Robert Kennedy was assassinated nearby in Orange County.
Yeah. Which is really, for us younger people, and I'm going to say that in general here because we're all within a few years of each other. I mean, a decade or so. Most of us have no real, I mean, we had superstars growing up. I mean, we had like Michael Jackson and stuff, but like back then, because the internet and access to media was really limited. I mean, when I was growing up, it was
homogenized.
It was TV and radio.
Yep.
That was it.
Yep.
You got what the media gave you.
Yep.
You could not go out and seek it on your own. You had maybe radio alternative stations,
but there was a shared experience. Everybody was listening to the same networks or listening to the same. Yeah,
and it was really hard to even save up a little bit of money when I was like junior high and high school age to go to a record store and try to find something that I had heard of. You can't listen to it unless you buy it. So it's really there's a huge wall of back then.
Right, you
access
listen to whatever the 3 radio stations you can get.
Correct.
Plays for you.
Yeah. Well, like I'm thinking of an era of where you would pay like $18 for a CD for one song.
Yes.
And there would be like 14 other songs on the CD too that you didn't care about. Right. But you paid $18 for that one song.
$9 for a cassette tape, brand new.
Yeah.
Or $15, $12 for a cassette tape. And you're like, well, I could get that used for $3 later on.
And now we live in a world of Spotify.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of digital media.
Who carries this podcast? We should say them.
All of them do. This podcast is available pretty much on all channels of all media.
And they're all available.
Right.
Apple, Google.
We are going far afield.
We
This
are.
is no longer about this film.
Well, we're talking in general about media and how that really had to play into what the Colonel wanted, and he had to appease those people because he signed the contract, Elvis.
Right.
did.
He had to appease the 3 major networks.
Yep.
And the 2 or 3 music labels.
Oh, and the
Elvis
backlash
was
from
an
politicians.
RCA. Yeah.
No.
And there's some interesting take on how did that affect him in the short run. It really he just gave up. Elvis stopped trying to want to being his own person and just did that for a while because it paid the bills.
He's portrayed as being a victim of sorts in this movie. Like there are ways where it seems like everybody wanted something from him.
He had to reclaim it.
Yeah. In all honesty, Elvis was from a very poor family.
Yeah.
Very poor educated. And Colonel Tom Parker came in and offered him more money than he'd ever seen. And so he just followed Colonel Tom Parker and his advice on his career.
I just wonder, like the earlier years, how much truth there was into what we watched versus what really happened, and did it really play out that way? I mean, I don't know.
Elvis was really poor.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
Like, really poor. I mean, we've seen it with countless other young individuals who suddenly have more money and more fame than they've ever known what to do with. They are easily manipulated.
It's overwhelming.
It's overwhelming, and you just ask somebody, what do I do? And if you kind of trust that person, that person's going to work for their own best interest.
They are, and they usually do, and that's what's really sad.
And we see lots of young actors, young pop stars,
Sports athletes as well.
athletes burn out, flame out, do weird shit. Justin Bieber.
Britney, free Britney.
Yeah, Britney.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Macaulay Culkin.
Yeah.
Corey Feldman.
I mean, it's kind of sad. Fame, as they say, with lots of money comes great responsibility, because if no one ever teaches you how to spend it and use it, you get stupid. That's a common thread with most, if not all, of the people mentioned. Some people adapt to it and have good management. Most don't. They get thrown into it, and you're just like, oh, what do I do now?
Yeah, I'm reminded of like the wealthiest musician in the UK for decades was David Bowie. And it's not that he had the biggest hits. It's just that he financially managed his estate really well.
He retained his rights.
Yeah. And there was 2. I'm thinking, was it Def Jam? Like somebody in the R&B world was just a really savvy business person, and I'm gonna have to look this up now. It's gonna bother me.
Hey, so speaking of
but getting back to Elvis,
speaking of hip hop, there were a couple places in the film
Yeah.
where hip hop was musically montaged onto
Mm-hmm.
R&B hits, especially in. I noticed it twice when Elvis visited Beale Street in
Yes.
Memphis,
Yep.
which is where the R&B music was played live.
Yeah, and
There were
there's
guitar solos too that were interlaced over Elvis's music. That like it
Yeah,
just
so it was
like,
an audio montage, a musical montage where several different songs, different rhythms were playing on top of each other.
And I was thinking, like, how do, as a filmmaker, how would you approach like the impression of like, or the feeling of like novelty, and the shock, and the difference that this would have carried 70 years ago, or 60 years ago for his later career. How do you in a film represent that in a way that a audience is going to see now? Because if you just play Hound Dog, everybody's heard Hound Dog. It's not going to carry the same emotional weight as it would have in the 50s when you had never heard anything like that before. And I was thinking, well, I guess the audio montage is a way to like amp up the energy of that music in a way that it still lands today in a similar way that it would have landed the first time that people were hearing it. That's my guess. I don't know
Right.
if that's what they were going for or not, but
My interpretation was to tie early blues all the way through time up to modern hip hop.
The lineage.
with Elvis's rock and roll kind of in the middle. So it's part of the same family tree.
the lineage of the progression of it.
And the
evolution of it.
linear progression, blues, rock and roll, hip hop.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the way I interpreted it.
I can see that though too. I was thinking, like, how does it hit?
Or to hit harder that I hope I don't come off as a middle-aged white guy,
but you are.
but I am.
We can't help what we are.
But to clearly show that at one point R&B blues was more of a African American music.
African American roots for sure.
And definitely for a while in America, hip hop was African American as well.
Right.
And so to clearly say rock and roll is part of this family. We are all kind of part of the same family, even though dominant American white culture has co-opted
Right.
African American culture.
So I just Googled the Elvis Presley movie soundtrack. Doja Cat, Stevie Nicks, Chris Isaac, Eminem, Diplo, Sway Lee, Austin Butler, Yola, Casey Musgraves, Lanesha Randolph. I have no idea who that is, which doesn't mean anything. Corey Younts. There's a whole lot of non-Elvis singers singing Elvis songs or songs with Elvis pieces in them being sampled or whatever. Obviously, there's some really good songs that Elvis does that are recognizable that everyone should know because they're so ingrained into our culture. At least
I mean,
our generation as Gen Xers,
he definitely
and Gen
influenced
ZY people,
everything that came after as far as American music goes.
Yeah, and some of them are remixes of Elvis songs.
Sure.
But there's a lot of original stuff in here too, which I find really interesting that they would choose to, I don't know, go that direction instead of just using all of his music for his movie.
I think that it might be a play to show how influential his legacy is, and like how far-reaching that influence is as well. Because I think if you were to try and identify, I mean, there's a couple of real big acts from like the middle of the last century. The Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Elvis, and it's like, how do you disentangle what their influences? And even Led Zeppelin like had R&B influences.
Oh, yeah,
too.
sure.
But like, how do you disentangle like if you're saying, okay, well, who influenced Doja Cat? Like,
I don't have any idea.
how do you like you can't disentangle, like, Elvis is part of that thread.
So is that a way that I think Baz Luhrmann is separating himself from other documentary or pseudo, or I don't even know. This isn't a documentary. It's just a take, a take on it. What
would the
makes
point
this
be to make this film unless you were trying to say something
correct
to make
else
money?
or new?
And I think that's a good point. I really appreciate the fact that there are musicians and artists and things out there that are like, hey, yeah, I'd love to be a part of that soundtrack because that sounds really awesome. Let's take what this entity was and the musical genius that he was, because he took pieces of different backgrounds that he was exposed to, from gospel to R&B to what the black community was singing and doing in the clubs where he grew up and what he was exposed to. And he took that and adapted it into his own self. And that's, I think, what popular culture is today, most indefinitely. I'm like, everybody's borrowing from everybody.
Right. Everybody samples everybody else.
Yeah.
So there was some criticism I read recently about a new Marilyn Monroe project, and the criticism was around how it was really portraying Marilyn Monroe as just an endless victim, and it was like such a sad drumbeat throughout this movie, and it wasn't really real to her life because like she did have some happy moments. It wasn't a happy life all the time, but I'm wondering like, well, that article in that movie poses a question here too for Elvis to say, well, what do you do to respect the legacy of somebody who lived a public life,
A very public life.
and like and how do you stay true to like what the facts were, but then also show like, yeah, I mean there were some I will say unhappy developments in the last decade of his life for sure.
Yeah.
How do you represent that on a screen in a way that's both respectful and honest, but then also too nuanced enough. This is a really long way of saying of making a statement saying that I don't think Baz Luhrmann made me care more about Elvis than I already did before this movie. Like
That's accurate.
Elvis as a person didn't really come through as a person. Like there was an idea of who this guy was. And
Yeah,
there was an idea,
yeah. I mean, that would be my
but-
major criticism of this film. Is that it's really a lot more about style over substance.
Yeah, right.
Like there was not a lot. There weren't any scenes in the first half hour where they were actual scenes. It was really just all montage with voiceover from Colonel Tom Parker.
Like atmosphere.
Yeah, it was not a movie. It was a tone poem. It was a visual audio poem.
And maybe that's why I didn't like care about the characters as much as nominally I think I should. Like I think I should care about Lisa Marie and Priscilla and like I should care about Iris.
And even Elvis. I think we would have cared a lot more in the last half if we had been allowed to see a human being in the first half.
Right.
And quite frankly, I enjoyed about the last half much more than the first half.
I felt more human.
Well, there were more scenes. There was virtually no voiceover from Colonel Tom Parker after the Hollywood. Once he went to Vegas. Vegas, I started enjoying the movie more, even though that was kind of the slow slide into oblivion for
decline.
Elvis.
Yeah.
But at least there were dramatic scenes where people were acting, and it wasn't just all music and boxes and layered video the whole time.
What were your thoughts overall otherwise on the sound design? And the visuals were amazing because the guy who did it, Baz Luhrmann, is known for just in-your-face production and sometimes too much. Like, could it have been simpler? Could you have edited this down? I mean, how many times do you need to see a girl scream and throw her panties on stage? Because that was repeated hundreds of times.
Well, how many times does the drone have to do a curlicue like loop-de-loop before it shows the sign at the International with Elvis's name on it?
That was done about a dozen times too.
Right.
It seemed like it was trying to hit every single key point in Elvis's life. And that's why it was 2 hours and 50 minutes. And it
I
could
thought it was
have
2 hours 40 minutes.
whatever it was. It was longer than your
film.
90-minute, hour and a half film for sure. And we could have done without some of that.
I definitely would have agreed to trim it way down. But if they've got the money, and this thing, I think I read on IMDb that it was made for around 85 or 90 million bucks, and then it was so far it's grossed over close to 400 million. So I mean, it's made money for everybody. I'm happy about that. It's an interesting film. I'm glad we watched it, but wow, I mean, I was starting to fall asleep there because I'm like, it's okay. You can get up and go take a pee break at any time, and this is actually. If you want to punish your kids, if you want to punish your teenagers, make them sit through this because this is a long ass boring film.
Dan's endorsement: punishment for your children.
Yeah.
Punishment for your children. There's very little violence, if any. There's very little foul language. Nothing that they haven't heard, on the playground. And really, there's zero sex. There's zero nudity. It's basically just a PG-rated biopic.
Partial education on race relations in the United States.
Yes,
A little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah,
And-
so Baz Luhrmann has done 7 films. I've seen 5 of them. This is my least favorite Baz Luhrmann film.
okay.
Moulin Rouge Romeo plus Juliet, Australia, Great Gatsby, Strictly Ballroom, his first film. Excellent take on the ballroom dance championships in Australia.
Yeah.
A lot of fun, actually. Moulin Rouge, about the same length. I found it much more enjoyable.
Yeah.
I remember really liking it. I can't say very much because I saw it a long time ago, but I remember
Lots of
enjoying
really
it.
good music and inspirational music at that. Very
Yeah.
empowering to the people who were singing it.
But
versus-
very similar to this film. Lots of great music, lots of visual interest,
Yes.
but better story.
Yeah. I want to say that there's a number of times in the film that I was waiting for something to happen. Like, wow, they didn't spend a whole lot of money writing
Scenes.
any scenes.
Yeah.
Or you have all these guys who hung around Elvis as Memphis Mafia and not one of them gets talked about.
Or has a name, or,
has
like
anything.
or
Yeah.
necessarily like we don't know who are they necessarily in relation to Elvis, other than like his posse, his hangers-ons.
Yeah.
But like, how does he meet these
Yeah.
dudes? Like,
And those guys were actually pretty interesting.
yeah,
I mean, that would have been interesting to see what they were getting at, not just Colonel Tom Parker, but
Right.
what were all these? I mean, there were like 11 or 12 of these guys that they were with Elvis from the beginning to
Yeah.
the end.
Yeah.
And they moved into Graceland with them, but we knew they were there in the film.
We saw him.
We saw them, but
He
they
yelled.
didn't
Elvis
have
yelled at
any
him.
lines.
Elvis yelled at him one time to get the hell out of my house.
Yeah.
Because they came in kind of raising a rabble,
Well,
and it's like,
yeah.
okay.
There was one guy who had like two different scenes of dialogue, and one was around promotions and like, you know, what do you do to promote other unrelated, not music related products, and then the other one was international touring, and like those were the two scenes that the Memphis Mafia really.
Headlines.
Yeah.
I give props to Tom Hanks for being willing to be in all of that makeup because you could tell who he was,
It took me a minute,
but
it took me.
he
a minute.
has a big old nose and he
had a big old latex
yeah.
face thing
And-
with wrinkles.
And I think he pulled off a very Swedish accent the whole time. It took me a little bit. I was like, that's not Southern at all. That's very Swedish. That's not.
I think it's supposed to
or
be
Norwegisch
Dutch.
or Dutch or something.
It's supposed to be Dutch.
It does not sound American at all.
No, but he said he was from West Virginia, and I was like, huh, how interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We know he's the shyster from get-go.
Yeah. There's some probably not so good things about him out there, and we're not going to really go into that anymore. But I really appreciated the fact that he was able to act and interact and tell a really good story from his perspective, from the character's perspective throughout the film. He didn't really get cut off. It showed him playing his cards very, very well. Every time he wanted to bring him back into the fold, he knew how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
He played Elvis really well. And some people would say
The whole family.
that he played the whole family
Yeah.
really, really well and took him for a lot of money. I mean, if you're getting paid $1 million, he was just going to pay $1 million a year for when they started, and who knows if that's true or not. But then to have all of Colonel Parker's debts, past debts forgiven, and then an unlimited bank account or,
A line of credit.
given
In
to
Las
him
Vegas,
in
at the
Vegas.
gambling tables where he had
Yeah.
apparently a gambling problem.
Yeah, they also said at the end in the kind of credit scenes that Colonel Parker spent the last years of his life just wandering around the Vegas Strip spending money, and that's kind of sad because it's like, well, he knew how to use what he had in front of him as promotion does. That's what promoters do, and that's
Yeah.
what management does is to promote the people that you're trying to get money for it so you can get your cut.
Well, it's kind of it's a sad movie in a couple of respects because one of the early scenes establishes this value of family being more important than anything else, and all of the main characters give that up.
They do, every single one. Priscilla, they do show that Elvis met her on his 2 years in the military in Germany, and it's like they really didn't give her much dialogue other than that right there when she met him, and then maybe a couple of short lines and scenes later on, which was really sad because if this person had that much influence over him and he wrote a lot of songs about her, you'd think you'd want to give her a little bit more screen time or at least dialogue and give him more influence other than,
Yeah.
hey, how this is where we met, and then later on I'm leaving you.
But
that was pretty much it.
Kind of like the earlier comments, though, of like this being a visual poem, or like kind of a lot of montage, a lot of music montage. Like there wasn't a lot to set up the characters and their relationships and how those characters changed. So I think, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Dan. Like it would have been nicer to see more of the story arc between Elvis and not just Priscilla, but everybody that was close to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, this was told from the perspective of Colonel Tom Parker on his deathbed, as we said at the beginning.
And he wasn't there when Priscilla met Elvis.
Yeah, he's just telling it from his perspective. So I don't know, maybe there we go. So all right.
And as we watched this, we drank beer.
We did. Thank you, Brian. You're the expert of giving us really great transitions.
Yeah, that was a really seamless segue.
This is movie and a beer.
Movie and a beer. Well, we drank two. Aaron is going to give us some insights onto some of the non-alcoholic things he enjoyed. And Brian and I are going to try to talk about these two beers. I, again, went out to John's Marketplace in Southwest in Loma Village. And during that time, I walked around for about 20 minutes. And there you have a lot of shelf space and a lot of coolers trying to find anything.
You have gotten a lot of good beers from John's Market before.
Yeah. And I knew that they had to have something that was probably going to work or not work, but I just wanted to find something with banana that wasn't a Hefeweizen, because I was like, hey, there's banana smoothies and all kinds of fun stuff out there that I know I've seen. Unfortunately, like that whole kind of fad is starting to fade out, so it's hard to find anything. And I know that there's a lot of places that do like peanut butter beers, like with either a stout or a porter or whatever, or either a sour
this time
beer.
of year, it's all pumpkin spice, right?
It is. So it's kind of hard to find some interesting different stuff. The cool thing was I actually found a couple, and I think both of them, because we paced it out, being a super long movie. I think we did a good job pacing it out. And the first one we had was from England, from Eagle Brewery, called Banana Bread Beer. Now, Brian said that this initially had like an IPA, but with a whole bunch of bananas squished on it.
Tasted a little hoppy with circus peanuts on top.
Yeah.
And as disgusting as that sounds, it was actually a kind of nice little beer. I enjoyed it.
So if you don't know what circus peanuts are, they're kind of like a harder marshmallowy looking, about 1.5 inches, 2 inches long. They kind of look like if you were to take a smaller hot dog and just chop it into smaller pieces, with kind of, sometimes they're different colors and sometimes
they
they're
look like
powder, foamy
peanuts.
Yeah.
And they're orange and they taste like bananas.
They do. Well, not always taste like bananas, but correct. This had that artificially flavor.
Right.
It's
got artificial banana flavor on it.
And I didn't mind it. So you'd say, well, why did you find a banana beer? Because Elvis, which they didn't get into at all, primarily ate peanut butter and banana sandwiches. That was his thing.
His favorite snack.
Yes. Peanut butter and banana.
And it was kind of his soothing food.
Yeah,
reminding him of his mom. Or kind of down.
So this banana bread beer from Eagle Brewery, 5.2 ABV, 22 IBU, inspired using local water. So this was not brewed. I think this was brewed in England, but not by the brewery. It was commercially done by someone else and then distributed. And they use fair trade bananas, which I applaud them for. It does have some banana aromatics, but it also has a little bit of peppery spice and there's a little bit of hotness on it from the hops. Gives you a lot of acidity up front. When you drink it, you're like, oh, yeah. But I think as it warms up, it gets a little bit more smooth.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely an easy drinking beer. Bananas up front, a little bitter in your mouth after you swallow.
But overall, good beer.
Good beer.
I think it went okay with the film.
Went well with the first half of the film, which is when we drank it. It was kind of, I would say it's kind of an odd beer. Not your normal beer, which was fine because the first half of the film was kind of odd. A lot of montages, as we talked about. Yeah.
Not necessarily something I'm going to go out of my way to ever get again, but not bad.
Not bad, and didn't go badly with this film.
Correct. The second one that we did was called PB and Jam, which is an Imperial Pastry Sour Ale. And this one is by a company called Wild Barrel Brewing. And they're out of San Marcos, California. So down in California. And this is 8.4%. I couldn't find an IBU on it because it really doesn't have any bitterness at all. It's just really tart. Organic peanut butter powder, boysenberry, black currants, huckleberries, vanilla bean, and lactose. So this is what you would typically call a smoothie beer, but it actually didn't have a lot of pulp in it. It didn't have a lot of smoothiness. It was more like a kettle sour that had a bunch of peanut butter powder and then lactose dumped on it. For those that are beer drinkers, you might understand what I'm talking about. If you're not a beer drinker, you're like, I have no idea what you just said. So basically,
if you're a casual beer drinker, it was gross.
This is a really hard beer to drink. I'm not going to lie. Brian and I were both like, oh, that's interesting. So the banana beer was smoothed out over time. This beer dropped completely off, had zero carbonation. You still got a little hit of the tartness from all of that fruit. That fruit, they use purees. I'm sure there was a very small hint of peanut butter on the back. You could tell it was a powdery peanut butter because it kind of just sat on the back, and then it was like, all right, there's peanut butter there, but this was not a PB and jam sandwich. Like
overwhelmingly tart berry.
It was just as I mentioned, probably a kettle sour beer that just, oh my gosh, it was very dry. Wasn't necessarily bad, but I would never ever seek this beer out again because it was just like, wow, I don't want my taste buds to go wacky.
Yeah, it's just not what I drink.
Yeah, I had to go get water. I was like, I'm drinking water during the show, but hey, I was like, I got to cut this with something. And again, this did, as it warmed up, got a little easier on the tongue, but I think that was also after it hit so much tartness, it just kills your taste buds. And at that point, it doesn't matter.
Your palate gets overwhelmed.
Yes.
For me, it was my third beer of the evening. About halfway through the can, I was done. I was kind of done for the evening, and it did go okay with the second half of the film as Elvis was in decline.
Yep.
So we could interpret that as his life soured.
It did. It really soured. And this
his
is a
life
sour beer.
got tart.
It did, very much so.
And so the beer kind of matched, but yeah, I don't want to drink it anymore.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you are going to seek beers out for a film this long, find something that's not so big in alcohol.
Yeah.
This was a big beer. You didn't taste the alcohol, but it hides it really well. But I'm like, wow, I only needed one of those. I'm not going back for a second. The first beer we had, I did a second one simply because we had 2+ hours, and I'm like, I just don't want to do 2 beers over the course of that long because I'm just going to drink a bunch of water and have to get up and go pee a bunch and all this and that, as we all know. Aaron, you had some interesting seltzers and things.
Well, I did. So I'll say I started. I should say I'm a person that can drink tonic water without
straight
mixers, like it was straight. And I realize not everybody does that.
I can't do that.
Not everybody likes that, but
quinine.
There's something kind of acidic and really refreshing about it that I've always liked tonic water straight. Like I like it with a gin and tonic too. Don't get me wrong, but like I'm happy to drink tonic water straight. And to me, what I picked up, it was a Q Spectacular Tonic. It's the company is actually making this in New York, so it's come a long ways here for Portland, but it was a nice tonic. I would say it was well balanced. I like the quinine when it's like actual legit quinine and not some artificial or facsimile
flavor.
Yeah. And so it was well made. It was well done. I'd say I'd be happy to have this again. I think it does have kind of a parallel. I mean, this is like crisp and refreshing, but it's also kind of a niche drink to have on its own. And I think in this day and age, if you're like Elvis obsessed, that's kind of a niche thing too, right?
Yeah, very much so.
It's a little idiosyncratic if you're, yeah. The other thing I had is familiar to anybody who shops the discount aisle. That's the Polar Ice seltzer. It was the orange vanilla, which I'm going to say the tonic matched the film a little bit better just being kind of, it's great if you're a fan of it.
Yeah, and I think the same thing applies to this film. I've got some relatives and family members that are like, oh, you got to do the Elvis one. And I'm going to shout out to them, yes, because we're doing it because of you. We had other options, but I promised my cousin we would do it. And so, Steve, this one's for you. I'm glad we did it. It was an interesting film. It was a little
Thank
longer.
you, Steve. I like watching Baz Luhrmann films.
Yeah,
so
it was visually
I would have seen
interesting.
this.
Yeah, I mean, I the whole thing was like, we really just should do it because I've read some interesting reviews. I pulled up a couple of the
It
bigger
wasn't a
newspaper
bad
reviews.
film.
It wasn't, but wow. I mean,
I won't watch it again, probably.
yeah.
Well, I probably wouldn't have ever seen it had. So thank
Yeah.
you, Steve. This was a movie I would have missed
Yes.
otherwise.
Call him out on that one. I really appreciate the music that was done.
Yeah.
I think this was, as Brian mentioned, more of like a music montage video. You know, we're saying thank you to Elvis for his influences and for what he did for the music industry and for, you know, raising awareness and bringing different styles of music that were not easily accessible to a majority of the population that were then becoming available. And the influencers were there and you could see it and hear it and understand it. So I think from that perspective, good film. Little shallow in the I mean, if we're talking about it from a filmmaker standpoint, shallow.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it brought a whole lot new to the Elvis story
Yeah.
Yeah.
that wasn't already out there, but maybe it brought something new to a new audience.
Yeah. I mean, I applaud those, like I said, you know, Doja Cat and Eminem and a bunch of other fairly well-known new artists or newer artists are lending their talents.
Kind of paying
to their,
homage to one of their influences, whether they're aware of it or not.
Gotta appreciate that.
Directly
So-
or indirectly. Yeah.
So, any other final words before we bid farewell to our audience for this episode?
I'm all shook up.
Are ya?
Just don't step on my blue suede shoes.
Baby. He does say thank you, but he doesn't say thank you very much. Which I was waiting for that the whole film. I was like, oh, he's got to say it. He says thank you a lot.
I'll say the accent that, especially towards the end of the movie, it got to be harder and harder for me to understand what he was like, because it gets to
slurred
be
a lot.
very thick accent.
Well,
What-
I mean, he did decline. I
You
mean,
take a lot of Quaaludes and see how you speak.
yeah.
I'm fine.
And I did read, and I believe it to be true. And we talked about this while we were watching it, that the later singing and later on in the film, when he gets to Vegas, that's all actual, like a lot of the singing parts from Elvis's performances are the actual performances that he did. So they're lip sync. He's, you know, the actor is lip syncing to
for the latter part of the film.
Yeah, because it'd be hard to match that tone and that slur and be able to do it. The earlier, younger stuff, the guy is obviously a talented musician and singer, and he did a really phenomenal job. So, acting wise, really well done. Those actors that had an opportunity to have dialogue and speak, they did a fairly good job. No complaints about that.
Yeah, they were all
Yeah,
believable. They were all
absolutely.
well acted, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wish we got to see more of those characters and learn more about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But overall, okay, so thumbs down on the beers. I'm gonna poo-poo these. Find something that's not high in alcohol that you're gonna enjoy. Find a light lager or something.
Go the distance.
Go the distance with it because even though Elvis didn't drink a whole lot, there was an advertisement that we saw for hams or something. That
Bush. I think it was Bush beer.
Bush beer.
Yeah.
They're in
On Beale Street
on
in
Beale
Memphis.
Street in
Yeah.
Memphis. Yeah, there was an advertisement. I was like, oh, there's an ad. Yeah. So good film. If you are an Elvis fan, definitely see it if you haven't already.
Yeah.
If you're not an Elvis fan and you want to punish your children by making them sit through a really long, boring film, they'll appreciate the music. If they're old enough to appreciate music in general or like pop culture stuff, they'll be like, oh, that's where that came from. Oh, that sample was from there.
Yeah. I mean, no violence.
Zero violence, zero, really zero amount of
zero
you know,
adult situations.
Yeah,
No
nudity,
bad language.
Very little, if any. I don't
I don't know.
remember
There was a
any.
real sexy dance in the beginning of this
There
film.
was some sexy bumping and grinding, but that again is
Like,
not anything different. You know,
if you have
You see-
1950 social standards, you might be offended by some of what's
yeah.
going
But
on.
2022, probably not so much.
yeah, not so much.
Probably not so much.
Thank you, everybody, for hanging out. As always, the opinions expressed during the taping of this recording are those of the hosts. This is Dan signing out, and our Hydro homie's not here, so we're going to say you better hydrate or dihydrate. I drink a bunch of water because these beers were a little heavy, and I'm like, yeah. Find the time to drink some water and drink some other fun things. Is you got some tonic and some seltzer going on.
Vodka's kind of like water.
With potato.
All right, well, this is Dan signing out.
looks like
Thanks,
water.
thanks everybody.
This is Aaron. Thank you very much.
This is Brian. Thank you.
Take care.